Hello everyone, wishing you a wonderful day. Today we're diving into a shocking mystery. Yuri leaves for a business trip and suddenly a stamped document appears with Mrs. Nghia's signature. Yet she swears she never signed it. So how did Lin pull it off? If you enjoy the story, don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next videos. The moment Lin left, the house didn't feel safe anymore. The front door had barely clicked shut when Mrs. Nghia's knees gave out. Tu Tieu caught her by the elbow and guided her to the sofa, kneeling in front of her like a shield. "Breathe, Ko. Slow," Tu Tieu whispered, her voice gentle but urgent. "Look at me. You're okay." Mrs. Nghia's hands shook around her coffee cup. Her eyes were wet, unfocused, like she was trying to wake up from a nightmare and couldn't. I don't understand," she said hoarsely. "Why would she bring papers? Why would she bring that man? Yuri! I can't reach Yuri!" Tu Tieu looked down at the folder sitting on the table like a loaded weapon. The paper edges peeked out neatly, almost pretty, too clean for something that could ruin a family. "It's okay," Tu Tieu said, even though her heart was hammering. "We'll verify everything, right now." She opened the folder carefully, page by page, scanning for anything obvious. Company headers, seals, dates. Most of it looked official enough to scare someone who was tired, and that was the point. Fear makes people stop reading. But then Tu Tieu saw it, a thinner sheet tucked behind the emergency authorization. The paper was slightly different, older, slightly yellowed. And there, at the bottom, was a signature that made Tu Tieu's blood run cold. Mrs. Nghia's signature, already signed, already stamped. Tu Tieu's breath stopped. Her fingers went numb as she lifted the paper and held it up like it might disappear. "Ko," she whispered. Mrs. Nghia leaned forward, blinking hard. "What is that?" Tu Tieu turned it toward her slowly. Mrs. Nghia stared at the signature line and her face drained of colour. "No," Mrs. Nghia whispered. "No, I didn't sign that." Tu Tieu swallowed. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Mrs. Nghia's voice cracked, suddenly louder, panic flaring. "I would remember. I would never. I never signed something without reading." Tu Tieu's mind raced, pulling through the last few days like a reel of footage. Mrs. Nghia had been exhausted, handling paperwork late at night, signing routine documents, receiving visitors, accepting coffee, taking vitamins. People didn't need to force a signature if they could steal it. Tu Tieu's stomach turned. "Ko, has anyone asked you to sign something small recently? A delivery form? A receipt? Anything that felt harmless?" Mrs. Nghia squeezed her eyes shut, searching. I signed a package receipt yesterday. The delivery man said it was for office supplies." Tu Tieu's heart clenched. "Yesterday? Who was home with you?" Mrs. Nghia opened her eyes, trembling. "No one. Just me." Tu Tieu stared at the signature again. It looked like Mrs. Nghia. The same curve, the same pressure. But something about it was too clean, like it had been copied. Her voice dropped into a hard whisper. "Then she didn't try to make you sign today. She came today to make you believe you still had a choice." Mrs. Nghia's lips parted. "What does that mean?" "It means..." Tu Tieu forced herself to breathe. "It means she already has something she can use. Today was just her backup plan, or her distraction." Mrs. Nghia's hands rose to her mouth, shaking. "So, what now?" Tu Tieu's eyes sharpened. "Now we stop being scared. Now we get proof." Tu Tieu stood up and grabbed her phone. She didn't call Yuri again. She'd already tried. Instead, she opened her camera and began taking clear photos. The signature, the stamp, the date line, the paper edges, even the folder itself. Mrs. Nghia watched with wide eyes. "What are you doing?" "Creating evidence," Tu Tieu said. "Because if Lin tries to twist this later, we need a trail." Then she did something else, something quiet but decisive. She opened the drawer under the table, pulled out a small notepad, and wrote down everything she remembered from the scene. Lin arriving, Mr. Tuan's claims, the deadline, the speaker call, Lin ending the call too quickly. Cool, Tu Tieu said. From now on, you do not sign anything. Not for deliveries, not for neighbours, not for anyone. If someone asks, you tell them your hand is injured. Mrs. Nghia nodded shakily. Okay. And you don't open the door alone, Tu Tieu continued. If you hear the bell, call me, even if it's midnight. Mrs. Nghia's eyes filled. Uri should be here. Tu Tieu softened for a second. He will be. But until then, I'm here. She looked at the document again, then at Mrs. Nghia. We're going to the company, Tu Tieu said. We verify whether this paper is real, whether it was filed, and who submitted it. Mrs. Nghia gripped her sleeve. What if it's already too late? Tu Tieu's gaze turned steel. Then we find a way to break it. At the company office, the air was colder than the winter outside. Fluorescent lights, quiet halls, the kind of place where people's smiles were professional and their secrets were expensive. Tu Tieu kept Mrs. Nghia close, one step behind her like a protective wall. A young receptionist recognized Mrs. Nghia instantly and stood up. Mrs. Nghia, are you okay? We didn't expect you today. Mrs. Nghia tried to keep her voice steady. I need to speak to the compliance team. Immediately. The receptionist hesitated, then nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. They were led into a small meeting room. Minutes felt like hours. Mrs. Nghia's foot tapped the floor, betraying her nerves. Tu Tieu sat still, focused, eyes alert. Finally, a middle-aged manager entered with a polite smile that faded the moment he saw Mrs. Nghia's expression. Mrs. Nghia, he said carefully, is something wrong? Tu Tieu placed the folder on the table and slid the signed paper forward. We need to know if this document was filed. And who filed it? The manager's eyes widened as he read the header. His jaw tightened. This, he started, then stopped. Where did you get this? In my house, Mrs. Nghia said, voice trembling with anger now. From Lin. The manager's face turned grim. He stood and walked to the door. Please wait here. Do not leave. Tu Tieu and Mrs. Nghia exchanged a look. That wasn't the reaction of someone who thought it was nothing. 5 minutes later, the manager returned with 2 other staff members. Their faces were tight. One held a laptop, the other a printed file. Mrs. Nghia, the manager said slowly, this document was submitted yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Nghia's chest tightened. Submitted? Where? Into our internal record system, he replied. It's flagged for review, but the submission exists. Tu Tieu leaned forward. Who submitted it? The manager hesitated. Then he slid a printed page across the table. A log record, timestamp, user ID, and a name. Not Lin's, not Mr. Tuan's, someone inside the company. Mrs. Nghia stared at the name, lips trembling. That person works for me. Tu Tieu's eyes narrowed. So Lin has help. The manager swallowed. Mrs. Nghia, if this becomes official, it could grant temporary authority for transactions. We can put a hold on it, but we need a formal complaint and... Tu Tieu interrupted, voice sharp. Hold it now. The manager looked conflicted. We need... Mrs. Nghia suddenly sat up straight. Something changed in her face, fear turning into fury. I am the chairwoman, she said, voice shaking but strong. Put a hold on it. Now. The manager nodded quickly. Yes, ma'am. As he left, Tu Tieu leaned close to Mrs. Nghia and whispered, Cool. We have proof it was submitted. Now, we need proof Lin orchestrated it. Mrs. Nghia's eyes widened. How? Tu Tieu's expression hardened into calm determination. We bait her, she said. We make her think her plan is still working, so she reveals her hand. And just as Tu Tieu said it, her phone vibrated. A new message. Unknown number. Stop digging, or Uri won't come home to anything. Tu Tieu stared at the screen, her blood turning ice cold. She didn't show fear. She didn't breathe fast. She simply looked up at Mrs. Nghia and said quietly, She knows we're here. Tu Tieu stared at the message again. Stop digging, or Uri won't come home to anything. Her fingers tightened around the phone, but she didn't let her face show panic. She had learned something on the farm. When predators smell fear, they strike faster. Mrs. Nghia leaned in, whispering, "What is it?" Tu Tieu turned the screen toward her. Mrs. Nghyia's eyes widened and her lips parted as if she wanted to scream but didn't have the air. "They're threatening Uri," Mrs. Nghia whispered. Tu Tieu shook her head slowly. "Not Uri's life. Uri's home. His company. His future. They want you to panic." Mrs. Nghyia's chest rose and fell quickly. "Then what do we do?" Tu Tieu looked straight at the manager who had stepped out to place a hold. "We do exactly what they fear," she said quietly. "We keep digging, but we do it smart." She turned to the staff member with the laptop. "Can you print the submission log again and keep a digital copy? I want the timestamp, the user ID, the IP log, everything you can legally show." The staff member hesitated. "Miss, this is sensitive," Mrs. Nghia cut in, voice firm. "Do it." The staff member nodded and moved quickly. Tu Tieu then turned to Mrs. Nghia and lowered her voice. "Cool, they have someone inside. That means anything we say in this building can leak." Mrs. Nghia swallowed. "Then we can't trust anyone." "We can trust paperwork," Tu Tieu said, "because paperwork leaves fingerprints." Minutes later, they had the printed log, a clear record of who submitted the document, at what time, through which account. But it still wasn't enough. Not for Lin. Lin was careful. Lin didn't touch the knife directly. She made someone else hold it. Tu Tieu folded the paper and slipped it into her bag. Then she took Mrs. Nghyia's hand gently. "Now we set the trap," she whispered. Back at the house, Tu Tieu didn't let Mrs. Nghia collapse into fear. She guided her into the kitchen, poured warm water, and made her sit in a chair where she could breathe. Then Tu Tieu started preparing the scene. She moved the folder back onto the table, but not the evidence pages. Those stayed hidden in her bag. Instead, she placed only the emergency authorization on top, like bait on a hook. Next, she positioned her phone on a shelf near the living room, angled just enough to capture voices. She turned on audio recording, tested it once, then set it quietly where it would keep running. Mrs. Nghia watched her with trembling hands. "Is this legal?" Tu Tieu nodded. "We're recording in our own home to protect ourselves. We're not fabricating anything, we're catching the truth." Then she made one more move, one that felt risky but necessary. She typed a message from Mrs. Nghyia's phone, not to Lin, to the unknown number. "We verified the document. The company says it can be fixed. Come tonight if you want to help." Mrs. Nghyia's eyes widened. "You're inviting them back?" Tu Tieu's voice was calm. "If we chase Lin, she'll vanish. If we pull her back in, she'll step on the trap." A minute passed, then the phone buzzed. "Tonight, don't bring anyone." Tu Tieu's mouth tightened. "She's coming," Mrs. Nghyia's voice cracked. "I'm scared." Tu Tieu crouched beside her chair. "Ko, listen. Lin thinks you're alone. That's her advantage. But you're not alone. I'm here, and we're not fighting with fists. We're fighting with proof." Mrs. Nghia nodded shakily. Tu Tieu stood and checked the recording again. Everything was ready. That evening, the house felt colder than usual. The lights were dim, the shadows longer. Even the wind outside sounded like it was holding its breath. Mrs. Nghia sat on the sofa, pretending to look tired and defeated. Her hands clutched a blanket, fingers shaking under the fabric. Tu Tieu stayed in the kitchen, half hidden, watching through a crack in the door. Her phone was still recording in the living room. Then, the doorbell rang. Once, twice. Mrs. Nghia's breath caught. She forced herself to stand and walk slowly, like an exhausted woman who had finally surrendered. When she opened the door, Lin stood there alone. Same neat coat, same calm face, but her eyes were sharper tonight, like she expected victory. "Ko Nghia," Lin said softly, stepping inside. "You look worse." Mrs. Nghia lowered her gaze. "I haven't slept." Lin's lips curved faintly. "I told you, deadlines don't wait." Mrs. Nghia gestured weakly toward the table. "You said you could help." Lin walked to the table and glanced at the papers. She didn't sit right away. She looked around the room first, checking corners, checking windows, checking silence. Then she lowered her voice. "Where is Tu Tieu?" Mrs. Nghia swallowed. "She went back to the farm." A lie. Lin studied her face for a long moment. Then she sat down and relaxed just slightly. "Good," Lin murmured. "She's troublesome." Mrs. Nghia forced a shaky voice. "The company said it can be fixed." Lin let out a small laugh, not amused, mocking. "They'll tell you anything to calm you down." Mrs. Nghier's eyes lifted, watery. "Then what is real?" Lin leaned in, elbows on the table, voice turning intimate, like a confession meant only for the weak. "What's real," Lin said, "is that the document is already in the system." Mrs. Nghia froze, and in the kitchen Tu Tieu's heart pounded. Lin continued, calm as ice. "Even if they hold it, the trail exists. And if you make this hard, I can make it public. You know what happens when people hear chairwoman involved in fraudulent ownership? The board turns on you. The market turns on you." Mrs. Nghia whispered. "I never did fraud." Lin tilted her head. "Truth doesn't matter when a story is useful." Mrs. Nghier's lips trembled. "Why are you doing this?" Lin's eyes narrowed. For a second, the mask slipped. "Because you people took things that weren't yours," Lin said coldly, "and now I'm taking them back." Mrs. Nghier's voice shook. "So you planned this?" Lin's smile returned, slow and dangerous. "Chongia, Yuri leaves. You're alone. You're tired. Of course I planned it." In the kitchen, Tu Tieu's fingers clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palm. Mrs. Nghia pressed, barely able to breathe. "The man you brought, Mr. Tuan, who is he?" Lin waved a hand. "A tool, like everyone else." Mrs. Nghier's eyes widened. "And the submission log? Who submitted it?" Lin leaned back, satisfied that Mrs. Nghia was already drowning. "That part doesn't matter," Lin said softly. "Someone inside, someone smart enough to follow instructions." Mrs. Nghia whispered, "So you have help inside my company." Lin's eyes gleamed. "Of course. You didn't think I'd walk into a fortress without keys, did you?" Mrs. Nghier's face crumpled. "Then, what do you want now?" Lin slid the pen toward her, voice smooth again. "Now you sign the clean version willingly. That way there's no fight, no scandal, no pain." Mrs. Nghia stared at the pen like it was poison. Lin lowered her voice. "Do it tonight, and I'll make sure Yuri's company stays intact when he comes back. Fight me, and he'll return to ashes." Silence hung heavy. Mrs. Nghier's hand lifted slowly toward the pen, weak, cornered, terrified. And then, a voice cut through the room like a blade. "Put it down!" Lin's head snapped up. Tu Tieu stepped out of the kitchen, phone in her hand, eyes steady, voice cold. "I heard everything," Tu Tieu said. Lin's face went still. "You lied." Tu Tieu didn't blink. "And you confessed." Lin's gaze flicked quickly to the shelf, to the phone, to the angle. Her eyes widened a fraction. Then her expression hardened into something ugly. "Delete it," Lin said, voice low. "Now." Tu Tieu raised her phone slightly. "Already backed up." Lin stood up so fast the chair scraped the floor. "You think a recording saves you? I have people inside the company. I have—" Tu Tieu interrupted, calm and lethal. "You have a crime. And now you have proof of it." Mrs. Nghia clutched her chest, shaking. "Lin, please." Lin's eyes burned. She looked from Mrs. Nghia to Tu Tieu, then smiled, sharp and hateful. "Fine," Lin whispered. "You want a war? I'll give you one." She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back one last time. "Check your company tomorrow morning," Lin said softly. "You'll learn what it means to be too late." Then she walked out. The door slammed. Tu Tieu's chest rose and fell as she rushed to Mrs. Nghier's side. Mrs. Nghia whispered, "What did she mean?" Tu Tieu stared at the closed door, dread crawling up her spine. Because Lin didn't sound defeated. She sounded like someone who had already pulled another trigger, And far away in another country, Uri's phone finally lit up. One missed call, then another, but the signal flickered and died. Just as the storm reached home, Uri leaves on an overseas business trip, and the farm turns quiet for Ly Tu Tieu and Mrs. Nghia. Linh breaks the no-contact deal and shows up with a legal consultant, claiming a bank deadline and pressuring Mrs. Nghia to sign emergency authorization papers. Tu Tieu bursts in, questions the rushed process, exposes a suspicious speakerphone director, and blocks the signature. After Linh exits, Tu Tieu finds a stamped document already bearing Mrs. Nghier's signature, secretly submitted into the company system by an insider. They rush to verify the log, then bait Linh back home, recording her confession that she planned the timing, has help inside and wants control. Uri's calls fail abroad, leaving them alone as the company risks freezes, scandal and betrayal. When Tu Tieu confronts her, Linh threatens a bigger strike tomorrow and walks away furious that night,